So I'm particularly delighted to welcome, at long last, Professor Cornelia Pearsall, Professor of English at Smith College, and the author of Tennyson's Rapture, Transformation in the Victorian Dramatic Monologue, published by Oxford University Press. And she's editor too of the forthcoming Norton critical edition of Tennyson's poetry. She's published numerous interdisciplinary essays on subjects such as Charlotte Bronte and the racialization of burial, Robert Browning and funerary monuments, W.H. Auden and bombing, and Sylvia Plath and peace. She's currently completing two books. The first is entitled Tennyson's Disappearances, Imperial Expansion and the Unseen World, which is on the late poems and the archives and occultism of imperialism. And the second book project from which this Tennyson talk is drawn is entitled Firing Lines, War Poetry and Weaponry from the 19th Century to Nuclearity. And her title today is Nuclear Tennyson, the Poetry and Weaponry of War Panic. So over to you, Cornelia.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, good. Okay. And does everybody see writing on the wall? Okay, so I'm going to begin. I first just want to thank Val for valor in terms of just, fighting down the network collapses and keeping us all connected all this year long. I really appreciated all the other talks in this several year series. So thank you all for that. I also just wanted to note that it's an honor to be here among so many scholars whose work has meant so much to me. It's really great to see your names and sometimes your faces. So I'm going to begin. Some poems disturb the peace. That is, some war poems are written in peacetime, so they are more precisely incitement to war poems, what I'll term here war panic poems, poems that constitute not war, not yet, but rumors of war. Achille Mbembe, in the quotation from Necropolitics that you see on the screen, posits this condition of the not yet, the rumored, as our future state, which we enter henceforth, as you see in the quotation, from now on, in which it may not be possible to distinguish what is true from what is believed. Mbembe's context is speculative danger. He puts it, stories of threat, which are, he suggests, stories of chimera, of serpent-headed men, half cows and half bulls, labeled and yet unrecognizable as men, inhuman humans, which is to say, and again is his language, enemies who have it in for us and who seek to kill us gratuitously by surprise. The epigraph from Jacques Derrida comes from his influential essay on the subject of nuclear war, in which he acknowledges that, should it occur, it would come as, and I quote, a surprise, as well as an inescapable catastrophe. These are his terms, a remainderless cataclysm, and the ultimate event. And yet, Derrida stresses that at present, and I'm quoting also here, at present, nuclear war has never occurred itself. It is a non-event. It is, we might say, a rumor of war, the most storied of contemporary threats. He explains, and I quote, the explosion of American bombs in 1945 ended a classical conventional war. It did not set off a nuclear war. And that's debatable, of course, but it is a common view. Total nuclear war, Derrida argues, is a hypothesis, or if you prefer, a fantasy or phantasm. So a type, we might say, of serpent-headed man. And a quote here from him again: all sides can speak of it only in the mode of gossip or of doxa, which Derrida defines as opinion or belief. So the fantasy can encourage, however, and possibly fuel what Kathleen Lawless, in her essay titled Mapping the Atomic Unconscious, calls, and I quote, the slow violence of nuclear energy regimes by reducing nuclearity to the moment of explosion, and so only to that moment. In this talk, I'll be considering some poems engaged in a kind of slow violence, interested precisely in disturbing the peace or any illusion of it, poems seeking to eventuate a non-event. I'm curious about the anticipated military engagements that don't occur, that come to light imperfectly or not at all, made manifest only in a future that has lost recognition of their trace. Or in the mid-Victorian case I bring to you today, that come to light through poems best forgotten about a war that never happened. Bellicose poems waging an imagined war, panicking peacetime into crisis. War panic addresses a non-event, what Derrida calls, referring to the later, immeasurably greater threat of nuclear war. I quote, an event of which one can only speak, an event whose advent remains an invention. The war panic poems I consider here do not respond to enemies that attack by surprise, and that is because there are none. Tennyson's poems instead respond to and advance rumors of war, stories of threat, anticipated surprise. So aggressions that, as Mbembe puts it, have no reflection on what has effectively happened or taken place. In an essay on Derrida's concept of the non-event, Tsai Yin-Teo observes that, and I quote her, it may well happen or it may not happen, in either case necessitating vigilance, and she italicizes that word. So, in essence, I want to tell you what happened when nothing happened, and how it is that the nothing that happened is still happening. This talk is in three parts. The first establishes Tennyson's direct relation to crucial mid-19th century advances in weapons manufacture and proliferation, propelled and made possible, of course, by the Industrial Revolution. In this context, I provide a scattershot overview of his 7 war scare poems, which were written in January and February of 1852. In part 2 of the talk, I develop a more sustained reading of the fatal formal aims of a specific poem from this cluster, a poem that formed and reformed itself, as is evidenced by the 3 titles it cycled through. And I'll just say one is Rifle Clubs, that was in 1852. In 1859, revised version was titled The War, and in 1892, it reached its final title, which is Rifleman Form. So, and then in part 3, I explore how non-events hover around the past, present, and future, and possible lack of a future. Aiko Day, in her essay titled Nuclear Anti-Politics and the Queer Art of Logistical Failure, questions limiting, and I quote her, the meaning of the atomic bomb to periodization. So, in agreement with her, I argue that Tennyson's forgotten poems, not about war, but about war panic, in which anxious and hypervigilant anticipation of attack is both cause and intended effect, that those poems engage in a sustained, seemingly inexorable violence that is in anticipatory accordance with and now familiar as nuclear threat. In anticipation of that eventual argument, I'll follow Priya Sacha's lead in her statement that, and I quote, guns are a place to start. In her book titled Empire of Guns, she argues, and I quote, war did not trigger every aspect of industrial revolution, but it was the context in which that revolution took shape. It is impossible to factor that violence out. It is impossible, I think, to factor out that violence, indeed that weaponry, from a tradition of war poetry spanning from the Crimean War to the Cold War. In the book I'm completing, titled Firing Lines, War, Poetry, and Weaponry from the 19th Century to Nuclearity, I primarily address poems addressing and redressing conflicts that did materialize, all too brutally. My book begins with war panic poems, though, because of the creation in 1851 of a rapid loading infantry rifle that called the Pattern 1851 Enfield. And this rifle would, as one military historian puts it, fundamentally change the nature of Western warfare. It was introduced precisely in the period in which Tennyson wrote his 7 largely forgotten war panic poems, which are themselves, I will argue, about precision arms, literally and figuratively. Historians of the P-1851 Enfield rifle and its successors maintain that, and here I'm quoting retired British Lieutenant General Phil Jones, although rifle technology in terms of materials, automation, ammunition, and sights still evolves at an amazing rate, nevertheless, and I'm still quoting him, it is the rifling in the gun barrel that still makes all the difference. And that's what the technology of 1851 made possible. Paul Lockhart observes in his recent book titled Firepower that, and I quote, the British transition from smoothbore musket to rifle musket was faster than just about any change of weaponry in a Western army up to that point. Industrialization made that transition possible. It was something that would not have been conceivable or doable before the mid-1800s. Following this innovation, Lockhart notes, the rate at which new weapons design appeared became almost exponentially faster after the middle of the 19th century. So this acceleration, I think, is both cause and consequence of what Lockhart calls, and I quote, the truly fevered aspect of arms races, their inescapable and circuitous logic. And this is, of course, a logic we all recognize. If we'd forgotten, we can see it every day now. Derrida observes of the nuclear proliferation that is rooted, I believe, in this historical moment that I address today. I quote Derrida, it is the war, in other words, the fable, that triggers this fabulous war effort, this senseless capitalization of sophisticated weaponry. So, in calling for arms escalation in the face of speculative threat, Tennyson fires, I would argue, an opening salvo. So let me just, that's the Enfield rifle. So you can imagine it. And I'll just move to part 1, Roofs of Change. You'll recognize one of Tennyson's most quoted line. I know that's a tough competition, but it certainly makes it into a lot of titles. As we know, the lines were written in technological error, and I'll remind you, they read, let the great world spin forever down the ringing grooves of change. The line from his 1842 poem Locksley Hall reflects the poet's mistaken understanding of railway cars as running in grooves rather than on rails. But the line is, I think, almost uncannily accurate when it comes to rifle technology. And just as a not, I think, incidental side note, Locksley Hall is read by many to predict civil and military aviation in lines about the skies filled with argosies of magic sails, pilots of the purple twilight. So rifling is entirely a matter of spinning explosives through grooves. According to a recent book about the 1851 pattern Enfield, the rifle boasted, and this is the book's description, 4 grooves slowly twisting in the barrel, which imparted a stabilizing spin to the bullet that delivered it to where the soldier was aiming. This differed from a smoothbore musket, which, when fired, sent the shot, and this again, I quote, blindly down the barrel, so that its trajectory was unpredictably wild. Tennyson was well aware of this technological advance. In one of his war panic poems of early 52, titled For the Penny Wise, he excoriates ongoing British use of the smoothbore musket, and this is Tennyson. Poor little people we, and in the world, belated. Our musket, as it seems, is superannuated. In another poem of this sequence of early 1852 war panic poems, titled Britain's Guard Your Own, Tennyson contrasts this obsolescence, this beeping for some reason, contrasts this obsolescence with the more sophisticated weaponry of the French, who had moved more quickly to manufacture and new designs for rifling. So in one of those lines, Tennyson declares, in France, the rifle is all in all. So an armaments historian notes, from about 1450 to 1850, firearms changed surprisingly little. The gun barrel remained simply an unadorned iron tube. Lockhart writes in Firepower that rifling is a very old technology, and as a verb, it dates, according to the OED, to the early 17th century. Until the invention in the mid-19th century of rifling machines, however, as well as elongated cylindro-conoidal bullets, rifles could not be manufactured easily or economically, and therefore were in limited use. Called the rifle musket by the British, first the pattern 1851 and then the pattern 1853, were issued to soldiers in the Crimean War and were decisive in several battles. You'll recall Crimean War ran from 1853 to 1856. William Howard Russell, the London Times reporter whose newspaper account of the charge of the Light Brigade in 1854 would inspire Tennyson's poem of that title, called this new rifle, and I quote him, the king of weapons, and more lyrically, if more disturbingly, the destroying angel. As Lockhart notes, with the rifle's dramatically improved range, accuracy, and power, rifling, as Lockhart puts it, made just about any firearm deadlier. And we can note that these remain the killing aims of arms technology, namely that the innovations operate more powerfully, more accurately, more quickly, more certainly, and more fatally. In Lockhart's summation, I quote, the adoption of the rifle musket was a milestone in the history of military technology, and therefore the armies of the Western world pounced on the rifle musket, adopted by nearly every Western army by 1855. So I've obviously been emphasizing this just to be clear that this is the weapon that was a starting gun of, I'm going to argue, of the arms race and the ongoing pouncing of the armies of the world. Go to Rifle Clubs. This was Tennyson's war panic poem that I mentioned earlier that he continued to revise. And so that the last version was in 1892, or published in 1892, year of his death. Tennyson's war panic poems articulate his urgent response to arm and arm. And you'll see that in the last stanza. in the face of a perceived threat of a French invasion, as you can see in the last stanza of the 1852 Rifle Clubs. Given the 3 exclamation points in the title, the numerous single exclamation points throughout this stanza and throughout the poem look positively restrained, calling for weapons, muskets, and pikes. Again, I'm in the last stanza. The poet sounds off like a drill sergeant, calling specifically for the organization and arming of a volunteer militia in the face of the rise in France of Louis Napoleon in a December 1851 coup d'etat. Tennyson's 7 war panic poems of January and February 1852 were initially published anonymously in a range of newspapers, they're usually initially in the Examiner, with the express purpose, as the poet wrote to a friend, that they, I quote Tennyson, be published and spread as widely as may be. However widely dispersed at the time, though, this sequence of poems has garnered scant and mostly dismissive critical attention. And in truth, it could be difficult to avoid despairing or damning response to poems that make such aggressively repetitive demands, posing both aesthetic and ideological challenges. Robert Bernard Martin, still one of Tennyson's foremost biographers, describes these 1852 poems as works that, I quote Martin, any admirer would wish had never seen light. One of the only published essays centered on these poems calls them, and again I quote, the comparatively undistinguished verses of 1852. But these poems do distinguish themselves in various ways, I think, and should command more of our attention in themselves and in their company, given that they follow so closely on the heels of Tennyson's 1850 In Memoriam, preeminent work, as we know, of this poet and this period, and just in advance of 2 other major works of 1854 and 1855, the Crimean War poems, The Charge of the Light Brigade and Maud. Whether these 1852 war panic poems collectively constitute a bridge between Tennyson's more established and admired poems, or a detour or an outright roadblock, I'm going to argue that their implications extend far beyond an anticipated military event that never materialized. The coup d'etat of Louis Napoleon in December 1851 was endorsed by plebiscite, leading to what one historian of the phenomenon, whose book on the subject takes its title, Rifleman Form, from Tennyson's poem, this historian calls a British national, and I quote him, war panic about the rise of another Napoleon. In early 1852, just as Tennyson was writing these 7 war panic poems, an article in Punch observed, and I quote Punch, a very laudable feeling is growing in the hearts of thousands of British people, the feeling for rifle practice. I'm going to say a little bit, move into that, but I will just note that Tennyson's ode on the death of the Duke of Wellington is also part of this mix, and especially dismay over the rise of another Napoleon with Wellington now dead in his grave. So the House of Lords had rejected a bill to organize a volunteer militia, but although the forming of a rifle corps required the government's approval, the formation of local rifle clubs did not. This workaround can help explain Tennyson's extreme emphasis, I think to the extent that it can be explained, his extreme emphasis in the title of the first version of this poem, Rifle Clubs, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. So he's sort of clubbing us over the head with them. The Rifle Club movement, begun in 1852, was inspired by volunteer civilian forces during the Revolutionary and the Napoleonic eras. These were defunct by the 1840s, though the word volunteerism, defined initially, according to the OED, as the system of having volunteer military forces. So the military element of volunteerism dates from 1844. A volunteer in this context is not a member of a professional army, but rather enlists without conscription or draft to perform willingly, without pay, some special or temporary service. Such volunteers typically provided their own arms and equipment, including uniforms. I think it's worth noting the insurgent undertones of this movement, the calling into being of a paramilitary, because to my mind, that's what this is by definition, an unofficial militarized force that is not formally recognized or officially part of the government's armed forces, often like these rifle clubs, organized and armed light infantry units. So we might wonder then whether this mode of defending a state simultaneously defies it by privately augmenting its perceived inadequacies. Whether or not the poet laureate considered the paramilitary implications, he and his wife Emily put their money where his mouth was, each contributing £5 to the rifle club that the poet Coventry Patmore organized in 1852 among his fellow employees at the British Museum. At the time, this would have been a substantial donation adjusted for inflation. According to websites I checked last week, this amounts to close to £1,800 today. Probably depends a little on inflation, but it's a good amount of money. Patmore had attempted to recruit Tennyson to join this club. So perhaps the £10 earmarked by the donors specifically for the purchase of rifles, that's what the Tennysons specified with their gift, was compensation for the laureate's refusal, although honestly, I have trouble imagining Tennyson as an even competent marksman, and I'm going to credit that partly to his poor eyesight. The armed librarians were not alone, though. A historian of the Rifle Club movement notes that, and I quote, the volunteers occupied a central position in the public mind during the war scare years. The first of Tennyson's war poems, titled The Penny Wise, musters these troops, declaring, and I quote, "Oh, gather, gallant volunteers, in every British village." William Holman Hunt, wielding a paintbrush instead of a rifle, turned to allegorical sheep. His painting titled Our English Coasts from 1852, also known by its more diplomatic title Strayed Sheep, which is what he titled it when he exhibited it in France in 1855, conveys the vulnerability of an unshepherded sheep, a crowd of them, wandering witlessly unaware at the precipice of what Tennyson, in one of these 1852 poems, called England's naked coasts. Uses that phrase in the Wellington Ode, too. The poets Patmore and Tennyson were not alone in volunteering art for arms. In London, an artists' rifle club was founded, enlisting, among others, John Everett Millay, William Holman Hunt, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and William Morris, with John Ruskin as an honorary member. Morris was especially assiduous in his attendance, though he couldn't get the hang of marching. Among other mishaps, Maddox Ford shot his dog by accident during rifle practice, and Rossetti's response when issued any order was, "Why?" So, as a not incidental side note, when Wilfred Owen enlisted in June 1915, he joined quite determinedly the Artist Rifles Regimental Association, as it had then become proudly aware of its founding members. In 1859, Tennyson revised rifle clubs and published it in the Times of London, and you can see the poem's placement at the top of the fourth column on that page. And 1859 brought a resurgence of the 1852 panic regarding a French invasion. Although, as you know, in the interim from 1853 to 56, France had been Britain's primary ally in Crimea. The poem has changed, and indeed, so had the rifles. And I'll just get us straight to the poem. Um, In 1852, Tennyson had denounced the musket as superannuated, and this was now true of the various iterations of the muzzle-loading rifle musket, which by the end of the decade had become what Lockhart terms a relic. Priya Satya gives the specifics. I quote her, in 1858, Wesley Richards' carbine became the first breech loader adopted by the British government, which now also required interchangeable parts from all of its weapons suppliers. Breech loading rifles decreased reloading time, increased firing range, and improved aim. So, describing a now familiar phenomenon, Lockhart comments an apparent revolution in weapons technology, revolutionary enough that all the Western armies spent vast amounts of money and went to extraordinary lengths to adopt it, was rendered obsolete by a subsequent leap forward almost immediately afterward. Tennyson titled this 1859 revision The War, and it's a title, as you see, printed with a decisive period, making a French invasion sound more imminent and inevitable than it turned out to be. This is a seemingly more restrained title, no exclamation points in it whatsoever, though, as you can see, they still abound through the poem. Yet, I think this title is far more threatening and conclusive. The title tacitly identifies the poem as somehow not only specific in its context, but general in its significance. The article "the" is definite, but its referent indefinite, as each war, for those involved in it, must surely constitute the war. And indeed, this poem, in each of its instantiations, is ambitious not only in its socio-political aims, but in its formal ones. A poem about the imperative to take form. It calls, I hope to show in the next section, an entity into being while simultaneously destroying it. And this is part 2, Tennyson's aims. Tennyson's war panic poems of 1852 and 1859 actively, excitedly sought to disturb the peace. As we've seen, they aggregate generically through linkages of content and context, and they are linked more entirely, I think, by form. These categories may not be distinct. I'm interested here and in my book Firing Lines in the multifarious and generally nefarious intersections of measure and munitions, moving beyond considering war in poetry only as cause or subject. I propose that a way to read these works as war poetry is to take very seriously the formation of the line. Lineation is, of course, a dominant descriptor and metaphor in British wars of the past few centuries, which were increasingly characterized by such technical terms and tactics as firing lines, front lines, battle lines, supply lines, lines of communication, lines of defense, lines of operation, the Hindenburg line, the Maginot line, and I'm naming only a tiny sampling of specific military operations articulated in linear formations. Bearing in mind Caroline Levine's point in her book titled Forms, that we may observe, and I quote, literary and social forms come into contact and affect one another without presuming that one is the ground or cause of the other. I'm interested less in causative explanations than in points of productive and destructive contact, particularly in a lineage of mostly canonical British poems spanning from the Crimean to the Cold War. And I think their canonical status is part of what should interest us. In his book, The Art of the Poetic Line, James Longenbach argues that, and I quote him, lines don't inevitably function in any particular way. And that's a point certainly taken. And yet I'm interested in some ways in which they may function in these mid-century war poems of Tennyson's, in which lineation is at once dramatized and thematized for a range of aesthetic and argumentative effects. Although written in league with one another and sharing a socio-political catalyst and ambition, these 1852 war panic poems of Tennyson's are each distinctive, sporting generally differentiated schemes of rhythm and versification. And in this, they may anticipate the kinetic formal innovations of the 1855 Maud. What they do share formally, though, is a dedication, even subjugation, to the structural framework of the refrain. The definition of refrain in the Princeton Handbook of Poetic Terms is a line, lines, or part of a line, repeated generally, though not always verbatim, at intervals throughout a poem, usually at regular intervals, and most often at the end of a stanza. So you all know what a refrain is, of course, but I want to emphasize here that refrain calls particular attention to the self-conscious mechanism of a linear shaping pattern of recurrence that the poem itself makes appear inevitable, or in the case of some of these verses, inescapable. A refrain thus thematizes in these poems the formation of a line as a line, marking lineation itself as central to a poem's formal workings. The refrains in these war scare poems unreservedly command attention, all the more so for their constant infelicity, which I have taken, perhaps overgenerously, to be a poetic choice and device. In the interest of time and your peace of mind, I won't bombard you with the refrains from all 7 war panic poems today. You'll have to trust me, though, when I tell you that they are there in force. I will single out one example, though, because it exemplifies the kind of question they can raise. The poem titled Pennywise, this, of course, is from 1852, itself asks a question that it then answers. Oh, babbling peace, actually, I might have it here. I do. Oh, babbling peace societies, where many a dreamer trifles. Is this a time to cry for peace when we should shriek for rifles? Arm, arm, arm. Those 3 words, arm, 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 are repeated at the end of every stanza, and they constitute, I think, an extremely awkward recurring line, arms akimbo, as it were. I find the lines composed of those 3 words hard to say, and I certainly didn't even try to shriek them for aesthetic as well as ideological reasons. And yet the line shares its form with one of the most consistently celebrated and plangent of Tennyson's lyrics, the recurring line and title of his 1842 poem, Break, Break, Break. I'll give you stanzas from each. So I put the first stanza of these 2 poems side by side. Break, 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 and arm, arm, arm both pattern the repetition of stressed monosyllables that even share the second letter R and an exclamatory context. My question for you is, why is one line so euphonious and the other so cacophonous? Or are they so differentiated? And here I'm really thinking about or questioning you about the discursive format and that patterning, rather than the content, which of course is quite different. So I do wonder, though, might each help us to hear the other differently? These are not rhetorical questions. I really do would really be grateful for your views. So to return to refrain, itself, of course, a mechanism of return. In each of the 3 versions of Rifleman form, the refrain ends each stanza with some variation of the two lines you see on screen, either following or sandwiching a third line ending with the word storm. So, rifleman form, rifleman form, rifleman, rifleman, rifleman form. This poem forwards linear repetition at the level of rhyme scheme. 2, whatever its sequencing, the word form rhymes, chimes with the word form, emphasizing the refrain's internalized repetition and the self-enclosed non-rhyme of a word echoing rather than or in addition to rhyming with itself. I wonder whether the many exclamation points recurring throughout each of these war panic poems, with what can seem a promiscuous affective urgency, themselves constitute a type, quite literally, of refrain. Refrain thus dramatizes linearity in significant measure, drawing attention to the formation of the line, to its shape and patterning, as much as to its content. Why was Tennyson so attached in his war panic poems to the framework of refrain? Certainly, he learned to use this device much more effectively and still more insistently 2 years later in The Charge of the Light Brigade, another poem born of and born by the medium of newspapers, and thus, strangely, close cousin to the 1852 war panic poems. In another chapter of Firing Lines, I write a great deal more about that poem's formal recurrences and deviations, but we might just note here very briefly that each stanza in The Charge of the Light Brigade ends with the number 600, and yet each stanza derives a different calculus from that number in its lyric, narrative, and affective accounting. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward. The poem's opening line seems a far cry formally and narratively from rifleman form, and yet you can hear its rhythmic echo in the dactylic meter of rifleman, rifleman, rifleman form. But I want to read these 1852 war poems not as training grounds for the charge, but rather as autonomous, in particular the poem Rifleman Form. Because if the charge of the Light Brigade is in part about the charge taken up by the poem to transform the 600 into wondrous heroes, the transformation wrought by Rifleman Form may be just as consequential and fatal. Exclamation points career through these titles and poems of the 1852 works, but we can't help but have noticed that. But I would add that they also show up in Tennyson's letters regarding these poems. And here's his letter to Coventry Patmore in 1852, enclosing this note with a copy of the poem Rifle Clubs. And this is Tennyson, very wild, but I think too savage, written in about 2 minutes. The authorship, a most deep secret, mind, Mr. P. Really, I think on writing it out, it's enough to make a war of itself. My wife thinks it's too insulting to the F and too inflaming to the English. Better not make a broadsheet of it, say I. It's intriguing that I think Tennyson won't write out the F word, by which I think he means French. Savage, secretive, swift, and in its countering of official government policy not to support volunteer armed forces, skirting sedition by almost making, quote, a war of itself. This poem, in all its versions, emphasizes form in both word and act, and I'll take us back to Rifle Clubs. The first version, written at the speed that would also come to produce The Charge of the Light Brigade, is animated by spatial specificity, stretching itself across the longest transverse distance in Britain, and you can see it in the second line, from John O'Groat's house in Northern Ireland, Scotland, rather, down across to Land's End in Cornwall. It is animated, too, by its own mimetic practice, quite literally, as in its third line, practice and fire, practice and fire, in which the phrase itself seems to take aim and reload, extending its firing line out along its dash. The direct address in the fourth and final stanza to engineers who were at that time on strike, workmen, workmen, away with your strikes, also enjoys the mimetic force of the poem's own relentless strikes, each ictus another blow. And the workmen who seek reform, and whom Tennyson in turn here seeks to reform, are doing other kinds of work in the poem. Certainly, they are standing or striking, in contrast to the volunteer force the poem is advancing. These volunteers would enter into significant obligations without any obligation to do so, not only unpaid, but at financial and potentially mortal cost to themselves. And the workmen are also contrasting by the fact of direct address. They are recognized as a body the poet can directly address. The rifleman, though, in what I think is a crucial distinction, can only at this point be the object of apostrophe, because in order to address them, the poem must first form them. Because Tennyson is not addressing an entity that as yet exists. This is not a poem that speaks to an organized, armed, outfitted, and trained volunteer militia, let alone an army unit, but rather to a body that his poem must call into being by way of its address. An apostrophe, you'll recall, is a figure of speech in which the poet addresses an absent person, an abstract idea or thing. And Shelley's Ode to the West Wind is a standard example. You can think of poems addressed to duty or liberty and other capitalized abstractions, or, of course, often to an absent or deceased person. In an influential essay on this figure of speech, Jonathan Culler asks, and I quote, "What role do apostrophes play in poems?" And we might say in answer that part of what they offer is a kind of role play. Apostrophe also conveys spontaneity and passion. This is Culler now again. Apostrophes indicate intense involvement in the situation described. And in their anticipation or hope of response, they seek to make the objects of the universe potentially responsive forces. I think we can certainly observe these dynamics at work in the Rifleman form poems, but particularly relevant is Culler's observation that, and I quote, "to apostrophize is to will a state of affairs, to attempt to call it into being by asking inanimate objects to bend themselves to your desire." Rifleman form is of necessity an apostrophe, that is, an address to an absent person, or in this case, persons, because the riflemen do not yet exist. That is precisely why the poem apostrophizes them. The poem thus necessarily addresses an abstract idea, the idea of riflemen, responsive forces to be willed into being by the poet's own desire. A poem that celebrates and calls for volunteerism is therefore a poem that undermines it to some degree, attempting, as it does, the work of conscription, calling on the exercise of free will to relinquish free will through what we might consider in this context the catastrophe of apostrophe. Barbara Johnson, in her important essay titled Apostrophe, Animation, and Abortion, also studies the figure of apostrophe, but she moves past the romantic odes on which Culler and many other readers of this figure of speech often focus to poems that I consider more relevant, however surprisingly, to Tennyson's Rifleman form, namely poems to aborted fetuses written by Anne Sexton, Lucille Clifton, and Adrienne Rich. And here are just some excerpts. Johnson writes, "Each of these poems exists, finally, because a child does not." And she asks, and I'm quoting, if apostrophe is said to involve language's capacity to give life and human form to something dead or inanimate, what happens when those questions are literalized? What happens when the lyric speaker assumes responsibility for producing the death in the first place? So, in the case of a poem to an aborted fetus, Johnson argues the apostrophe makes it, and I quote her, impossible to tell whether language is what gives life or what kills. Although Tennyson's poem differs entirely in context and register from those that Johnson considers, I find her insights and those of the poets she discusses profoundly illuminating regarding the figure of apostrophe, taking us beyond its more traditional capacity of calling non-being into being. In calling these riflemen into form, the poet may give life, or at least a kind of novel identity. In forming men into riflemen, however, the poet may also destroy them. That is, in Johnson's formulation, accept or be reconciled to accountability for what she terms producing death. And it's in the question of accountability that I think these poems demand attention. As I've noted, the muzzle loading rifles of the 1852 version of this poem were replaced by the breech loading rifles of the 1859 version. These new rifles could be reloaded and fired more rapidly and at greater distances, allowing for greater flexibility of movement and aim. They provided, as wars in these recent centuries consistently have, new technologies to kill in more ways. But Tennyson advances this technology, I think, so that his own aim is less to arm men with rifles than to reform their arms into rifles, reforming their human forms into instruments of war. The apostrophe to riflemen, whether breech or muzzle loading, muzzles them as men. John Ruskin's The Nature of Gothic, published in 1853 and thus essentially contemporaneous with Tennyson's initial set of war scare poems, helps to illustrate this point. I didn't put it on a slide, but you'll recognize these words, I think. Ruskin writes, observe, you are put to stern choice in this matter. You must either make a tool of the creature or a man of him. You cannot make both. Men were not intended to work with the accuracy of tools, to be precise and perfect in all their actions. If you will have that precision out of them, and make their fingers measure degrees like cogwheels and their arms strike curves like compasses, you must unhumanize them. All the energy of their spirits must be given to make cogs and compasses of themselves. So Ruskin emphasizes that it's not that these men make cogs and compasses, it is that they are made into them. And so it is in rifleman form. Volunteers take shape not with, but as weapons, singing of arms, and the men Tennyson forms them as men that are arms in the metallic muscularity of linear masculinity. Is it going too far to say that in the course of forming riflemen, the poem's refrains sentence them to death? I clearly don't think so. The logic, the trajectory is so absolute for death on both the rhetorical and practical level. The apostrophe to riflemen at once forms and destroys them. Simone Weil, in her seminal 1943 essay titled The Iliad, or the Poem of Force, which is, of course, on Western literary tradition's foremost war poem, observes, force is that which makes a thing of whatever submits to it. And she continues, exercised to the extreme, it makes the human being a thing quite literally, that is, a dead body. Someone was there, and the next moment, no one. The Iliad never tires of presenting us this tableau. In the tableau Tennyson presents us, the human being is made a thing before even entering battle. Indeed, I would argue as a condition for entering battle. Someone was there, and the next moment, no one. It moves us to part 3. Tennyson's concern was with the question of how to defend the coasts of England, but the question for us may become how or whether to defend this poem. Each of its versions is manifestly about defense, but what to do with its offensiveness? A question, of course, with broader application to a range of poems by this and other Victorian poets. W.H. Auden edited a selection of Tennyson in 1946, interestingly, and in his introduction, Auden singles out this lesser-known poem, Rifleman Form, though it is the best known of that sequence of 7. He singles out Rifleman Form as exemplifying, and I quote, the aspects of Tennyson that are now so distasteful to us, the schoolboy froggy hater of Rifleman Form. Auden argues a poet may write bad poetry in 3 ways. This is in his introduction to Tennyson. The first being, this is Auden, he may be bored or in a hurry and write work which is technically slipshod or carelessly expressed. And this is a charge from which Auden exonerates his precursor. And I quote, from this fault, Tennyson is quite free. The second way in which a poet can be bad, as in Auden's term, is that, and I quote, by overlooking verbal and visual associations, he may be unintentionally funny at a serious moment. Auden provides 2 examples from Tennyson's poems. Neither is drawn from Rifleman Form, but I think we could identify some there without difficulty. And the third kind also seems opposite, and I'm quoting the third kind of bad poem. So I'm quoting Auden again. Quote, he may suffer from a corruption of his own consciousness and produce work, the badness of which strikes the reader, though one feels that the poet is very pleased with it. Auden concludes, trash is the inevitable result. And if Tennyson's work in this and other war panic poems is at once technically faultless, and trash, we may well come to ask how or can or should we reform the poet? That is, reconceptualize, recast works such as these. Although that is, of course, what each interpretation does, because the poet must now take form like his rifleman. My own talk today itself constitutes simply another apostrophe and dactylic refrain. Tennyson, 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 form. And it's in relation to ongoing formations and deformations and deformations that we should take Tennyson's exclamatory urgency seriously. Not, of course, his agitation regarding a French invasion of England's coast, though one might wonder parenthetically whether Brexit was another manifestation of kind of imaginary battle with the chimerical threat of Europe. That's a hypothetical thought from a far-off American. But I do take seriously the imagination of not merely imminent, but immediate danger, the activity of this reactivity to a non-event, the scars inflicted not by war, but by war scare. In its snare, no time is safe and no place is safe. The invasion might take place at any moment and in any location. The readiness is all and still more, so is the unreadiness, the endless condition of utter vulnerability. As an example, Winston Churchill also feared an invasion that never occurred at the start of a war that unquestionably did. His speech in the House of Commons on June 4th, 1840, is considered, this is the recent estimation by one of Churchill's foremost biographers, and obviously there are many. Um, the estimation is that this is one of the greatest addresses of history, and that does enjoy wide agreement, that opinion. Early in the speech, Churchill cites Tennyson, praising the efforts of the RAF during the evacuation of Dunkirk, which had just concluded on June 4th. The occasion actually for Churchill giving the speech. So early in it, Churchill cites Tennyson, praising the efforts of the RAF. He quotes from the poem The Passing of Arthur, clearly from memory, as his words are slightly inexact. And I quote Churchill: "Each morn brought forth a noble chance, and every chance brought forth a noble night." Could talk more about that because Churchill elides completely the context in which those lines are uttered in Idylls of the King. Churchill's command of Tennyson, or perhaps more accurately, Tennyson's command of Churchill, is evidenced by the numerous occasions in which the Prime Minister quoted the former poet laureate, often from memory and at length, and Locksley Hall was a particular favorite. But Churchill might have done well to search out the admittedly obscure invasion scare poems I've been discussing. As Churchill declares, we are told that Herr Hitler has a plan for invading the British Isles. This has often been thought of before. There was indeed a plan for land invasion called Operation Sea Lion by the Germans. It was never executed, though the targeted bombing that soon commenced over Britain was, as one historian puts it, intended to create maximum terror, culminating in an invasion in August or September once British morale had collapsed. That was the plan. But British morale was buoyed by Churchill's speech then and his speeches throughout the duration of the war. Perhaps this passage could be recited by memory from some in this audience, but I'm going to give you here its conclusion. "We shall go on to the end," is how, at the end of the second line on the screen, he begins a sentence so long it seems never to end, making use of a range of oratorical affordances of repetition in his own resolute repetition. Maybe we could call it refrain. We shall, we shall, we shall, we shall, we shall. Although there are clearly many ringing clauses from which to choose, this is commonly called Churchill's "we shall fight on the beaches" speech from this stretch of the peroration. And I've put it in boldface there. So I won't read it, but I will read instead a couplet from Tennyson's 1852 poem titled "Britons, Guard Your Own." And these lines read: "Should the French, should he land here, and for 1 hour prevail, there must no man go back to bear the tale." So if the invader comes, we will die in preventing their movement. As it had been for Tennyson and others nearly a century earlier, the defense of the British coast from a land invasion was of primary concern for Churchill. In a July speech, about a month later, Churchill asked one of his ministers, and I quote, "to investigate drenching the beaches with mustard gas in the event of an invasion." Questioned on this by a cabinet member in some consternation at the idea, Churchill responded, "Can't we do what we like with our own beaches?" In these months, Churchill visited virtually every stretch of hundreds of miles of coastline where an invasion was considered possible. And in this, this is a picture of Churchill during one of those visits to a coastal defense fortification. And as you see, he's holding a Tommy gun. A big shipment had just arrived of those from the United States at ruinous cost, as we know. Churchill had far more substantial and substantiated cause to fear an invasion of Britain, of course, than existed for Tennyson in the mid-19th century. Churchill's "We Shall Fight on the Beaches" speech was delivered to the House of Commons on June 4th, 1840, as I said, marking the conclusion of the evacuation of Dunkirk, which had begun May 26th. The speech was delivered also in the immediate wake of the unstoppable waves of German blitzkrieg, with the Germans invading Poland in September 1839, Denmark and Norway in April 1840, and Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and of course, finally France in May 1940. German aerial bombardment of Britain was already underway, although officially the Battle of Britain spanned from July 10th to October 31st, when, according to sources, Hitler officially shut down Operation Sea Lion. And I should say the Blitz, the bombardment of industrial sites and cities, differentiated in that there was no immediate plan for subsequent amphibious land invasion. It's just the bombing. I'm emphasizing that at the time of Churchill's Beaches speech, Britain was incontestably under threat, facing what would be a sustained and devastating aerial bombardment and on the verge of a long and appallingly brutal war. I want to follow Churchill, though, in linking what is arguably the wartime prime minister's most stirring oration to Tennyson. That is, both to the renowned poems that Churchill quotes from memory and to those that have been essentially forgotten, because it is vital, I think, that we distinguish events from non-events, the actual from the speculative attack. In 1940, as in 1852 and 1859, a land invasion requiring that civilians anxiously prepare for direct combat on the British beaches, armed with innovatively manufactured rifles and later submachine guns and, if necessary, mustard gas, did not occur. Military threats that expire rather than transpire are in their proleptic perturbations as menacing, at least for a time, as those that materialize, rendering eventful the non-event. My point here is that, like Churchill's in June 1940, Tennyson's is a voice prophesying not war precisely, but a dynamic of sudden assault with insufficient defense. This prophecy or rumor prescribes the panic that is both cause and consequence of arms innovation and proliferation, therefore dismissible and even risible, as Tennyson's 1852 and 1859 war panic poems can seem. They constitute, like Churchill's exponentially more admired 1940 Beaches speech, a consequential act. And I would not myself dismiss Tennyson's mid-century panic poems aesthetically. The forms they take are the forms they intend, whatever we may think of the politics and presumptions that animate them or the history that disproves them. Nor would I dismiss their effects, whatever their intentionality. Certainly, the arms race has from the start run on war scare, at once fueled by and fueling panic. Edward Grey, British Foreign Secretary from 1905 to 1916, and a major proponent of entering the First World War in 1914, reflected a decade later in his autobiography, I quote Grey, the enormous growth of armaments in Europe, the sense of insecurity and fear caused by them. It was these that made World War I inevitable. This is the real and final account of the origins of the Great War. In his 1862 book titled Three Panics, Richard Cobden scrutinizes the example of this 1852 panic of a French coastal attack. And Cobden observes, quote, "This state of mind is natural enough to those who embrace the hypothesis that we are in imminent danger of an invasion." He adds, in an insight in keeping with Edward Gray's more than a half century later, and I quote, "From the moment that such a theory of invasion as this is adapted, any plan of defense must necessarily be insufficient for security." So Cobden, as many of you will know, was a member of the Peace Society that the speaker of Tennyson's 1855 monodrama Maud decries as babbling. And Cobden himself decried the rising calls to increase armament expenditure, founded, Cobden writes, on vague and shadowy assumptions of possible danger. Derrida, writing of another situation of vague and shadowy assumptions of possible danger, that is, war scare, observes that non-localizable nuclear war has not occurred. It has existence only through what is said of it, only where it is talked about. He calls this war that has not occurred and may not occur, and yet demands ever increasing expenditure and escalation, a speculation, and then asks, and you'll recognize this from my first slide, who can swear that our unconscious is not expecting this, dreaming of it, desiring it? And yet, although the threat may seem fantastical, it fuels the weapons that are all too real. The presence of a triggers. As Elaine Scarry notes in a recent interview with Rachel Ablow, referring to the threat of nuclear war, and I quote, this is scary, "The unreality something has by having not yet happened is conflated with the unreality something might have by being merely imaginary." So reviewing this massive and ongoing proliferation of nuclear weapons, Scarry concludes that unless there is radical disarmament, nuclear devastation, and I quote her, "is going to happen." I don't know if it's going to happen this year or whether it's going to happen this century, but it's almost inconceivable that it isn't going to happen. And I think we can see that in some sense it already has happened, at least some fraction of it. Catherine Yusoff, in her book titled A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, reminds us of studies showing, and I quote, "The body of every human on the planet now contains strontium-90, a man-made byproduct of nuclear detonation." She also notes that the epic of the Anthropocene, of which arms production and nuclearity are major plot lines, I quote her, "is configured in a future tense rather than in recognition of the extinctions already undergone by Black and Indigenous peoples." Referring to one of the many extractive weapons-grade commodities, Yusoff writes, I quote, "The uranium mines for nuclear industry exploited and polluted indigenous lands and bodies, and returns in the nuclear colonialism of waste and Superfund sites." Aiko Day extends this to the, and I quote, "her entire imperial infrastructure of extra economic violence that undergirds," again, I'm still quoting, "the enormous quantities of arms." I would just add that these were first set into mass production in the 19th century. And this infrastructure, as Day calls it, is possibly soon to end in conflagrations, of course, of its own making. Drawing from the work of Black feminist theorists, Yusoff concludes, quote, "This is the material history that constitutes the present in all its geo-traumas." But she adds, it can be, these are her words, "reworked and reconstituted for the end of the world and the possibility of another." I think it's possible that Tennyson might ultimately agree with the deliberative turning from this world to the possibility of another, fascinated as he was throughout his works with worlds evolving towards their endings to be reformed and reformed by better ones. His mid-century war panic poems demonstrate that what has not yet happened underwrites what has and will. War scares hunger for weaponry has become our permanent state. And yes, I am drawing here a direct line from Tennyson's ultimately unwarranted war warnings to far more credible and consequential alarms, a line from his exclamatory shriek during peacetime to arm, 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 through to the arms races of several world wars and on to nuclear stockpiling, a line from the new 19th century industrial technology of rifling to the hypervelocity of nuclear warheads, because the logic or panic and the technologies that drive that logic of panic may well be the same, however accelerated and exponentially more damaging and deadly its devices. A war that you fear is one you are already fiercely waging. The war that's to come already has.